On December 11, 1941, a chill wind swept through the streets of Berlin, carrying with it the weight of impending change. Inside a dimly lit room of the Reichstag, military officers and government officials gathered, their expressions somber, as the Führer prepared to address the nation. Among them stood Lieutenant Karl Weber, a young officer whose service to his country had been unwavering, yet whose heart harbored growing doubts. The declaration of war against the United States was imminent. Karl had heard whispers, seen the preparations, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of the words that resonated through the airwaves, declaring Germany's entry into a war against a distant, powerful nation. As Adolf Hitler's voice echoed with fervor, Karl's gaze drifted to the faces around him, some alight with fervent nationalism, others masked in apprehension. In the days leading up to the declaration, Karl had sensed a shift in the mood of the country. Conversations whispered in the corners of cafes, the hurried steps of civilians on the streets, and the tightened lips of his fellow officers all spoke of unease. The war on multiple fronts had already stretched Germany thin, and the prospect of adding the United States to their list of adversaries seemed to Karl a gamble of catastrophic proportions. As the speech concluded, applause filled the room, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within Karl. He clapped along, his actions mechanical, betraying none of the skepticism that clouded his thoughts. The war, which had once seemed a distant affair, now loomed larger, its shadows reaching into every corner of German life. Exiting the Reichstag, Karl found himself enveloped by the cold embrace of the Berlin winter. The streets, usually bustling with life, felt eerily subdued, as if the city itself braced for the impact of the declaration. Karl's mind raced, pondering the implications of this new phase of the war. How many more lives would be lost? How much longer could Germany sustain the relentless push of conflict on so many fronts? The questions haunted him as he made his way through the city, the familiar sights now tinged with a sense of foreboding. The Brandenburg Gate stood tall against the gray sky, a symbol of strength and unity. But to Karl, it now also represented the isolation of a nation embroiled in a war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. Karl's family had served in the military for generations, and he had grown up on stories of honor and duty. Yet, as he witnessed the reality of war, the destruction, the suffering, the moral compromises, he found himself questioning the narrative he had always accepted. Was true patriotism blindly following orders, or did it lie in questioning the path his country was on? These thoughts were dangerous, Karl knew. Dissent was not tolerated in the Third Reich, and to even entertain such doubts was to risk everything. But as he walked through Berlin, the city's somber mood a mirror to his own, he couldn't shake the feeling that Germany was on a precipice, and the declaration of war against America was a step into the abyss. That evening, as Karl sat alone in his modest apartment, the weight of the day's events pressed down on him. The radio, now silent, had earlier buzzed with the fervor of Hitler's speech, the cheers of the crowd punctuating the air with ominous enthusiasm. Karl couldn't share in their zeal. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding, a conviction that the decision to declare war on America would mark the beginning of the end for Germany. He thought of his younger brother Hans, currently serving on the Eastern Front, and his heart clenched. The news would reach Hans soon, another burden for the soldiers to bear. How many more letters home would carry tidings of death and despair? Karl retired to bed, but sleep eluded him. The faces of his fellow officers, the voice of Hitler declaring war, and the subdued streets of Berlin swirled in his mind, a cacophony of doubt and fear. For the first time, Karl allowed himself to truly question the direction in which his country was headed. It was a moment of awakening, fraught with uncertainty and danger, but also the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps, in the darkness of the times, there lay the possibility for change, for resistance against the tide that threatened to engulf them all. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the city, Karl Weber knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But within him, a resolve began to take shape, a determination to seek out the truth, to understand the real cost of the war, and to find his place in the unfolding history of his nation. The declaration of war on America had changed everything, and for Karl, it was the beginning of a journey that would test the very limits of his courage and conviction. In the silence of the morning, with the city still asleep, Karl Weber made a silent vow. He would not let the war define him. Instead, he would strive to define himself amidst the chaos, to seek out light in the shadows of a world at war. In the weeks following the declaration of war on America, the atmosphere within Berlin grew increasingly tense. The city, once vibrant and bustling, now carried a sense of foreboding. Lieutenant Karl Weber felt this shift acutely as he navigated the streets, his previous certainty in the Reich's cause now replaced with a well of deep-seated doubt. It was during a cold January evening, as snowflakes danced lazily through the air, that Karl overheard the first whispers of dissent. He was at a local tavern, a place where military personnel often gathered to share a drink and momentarily escape the war's reach. The tavern's warmth provided little comfort to Karl, whose mind wrestled with the implications of the conflict's escalation. Seated at a dimly lit corner table, Karl sipped his beer, his thoughts wandering, when a hushed conversation from the adjacent booth caught his attention. Two men, their voices low and urgent, spoke of the madness of the war and the folly of fighting on so many fronts. They talked of friends lost on the Eastern Front and the senseless destruction wrought by the conflict. Intrigued, Karl strained to listen, the words resistance and change weaving their way through the snippets of conversation he could catch. The idea that there were others who shared his doubts, who dared to voice them, even in secrecy, was both shocking and exhilarating. Driven by a newfound curiosity, Karl found himself returning to the tavern in the days that followed, hoping to overhear more. His vigilance paid off one evening when he recognized one of the men from the previous conversation sitting alone at a table. Seizing the moment, Karl approached, introducing himself as a fellow officer and expressing a cautious interest in the man's views. The man, introduced as Friedrich, eyed Karl warily at first, but as they talked, a mutual understanding began to form. Friedrich spoke of a network of like-minded individuals within the military and beyond, who believed that the war was leading Germany to ruin. These were not defeatists but patriots concerned for their country's future, willing to risk their lives for the chance to steer Germany away from the abyss. Karl listened, a whirlwind of emotions churning within him. Here was tangible evidence of dissent, of resistance against the Nazi regime, something he had thought impossible. Friedrich spoke of secret meetings, coded messages, and the careful dance of evading Gestapo surveillance. The resistance was real, and it was growing, fueled by the desperation of a nation caught in the grip of a tyrannical leader. The conversation marked a turning point for Karl. The abstract doubts that had plagued him were now given form and direction. He was not alone in his beliefs, and the possibility of taking action, of contributing to a cause that sought to save Germany from itself, was both daunting and invigorating. In the days that followed, Karl wrestled with the decision to join the resistance. Every logical part of him screamed that it was madness, a surefire path to execution if discovered. Yet, the moral part of him, the part that yearned for a just and peaceful Germany, whispered that it was the only path worth taking. After much deliberation, Karl met with Friedrich again, this time in a secluded park under the guise of a casual stroll. With the snow crunching underfoot and the cold air biting at their faces, Karl made his choice known. He would join the resistance, lending his voice and his efforts to the cause of change. Friedrich welcomed him with a solemn nod, understanding the weight of Karl's decision. He spoke of the challenges ahead, the need for absolute secrecy, and the importance of trust. "We are few," Friedrich said, "but our resolve is strong. Each of us plays a crucial role in the tapestry of resistance. Welcome, Karl." As Karl walked home that evening, his mind was a tumult of fear and determination. He had stepped into a hidden world, one that operated in the shadows of the Third Reich, fighting for the soul of Germany. The risks were immense, but for the first time since the war began, Karl felt a sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The whispers of dissent had led him to a crossroads, and in choosing the path of resistance, Karl embarked on a journey fraught with danger but illuminated by the light of conviction and the possibility of a better future for his homeland. The decision to join the resistance had set Karl on a path fraught with internal conflict and moral ambiguity. The once clear-cut lines between right and wrong now seemed blurred, as Karl grappled with the implications of his choice. In the weeks that followed his commitment, Karl's days were filled with a mixture of routine military duties and clandestine meetings with Friedrich and other members of the resistance. Each encounter, each shared secret drew him deeper into a world that contradicted everything he had been taught to uphold as a soldier of Germany. One evening, as Karl and Friedrich huddled in the shadowed recesses of an abandoned warehouse, the gravity of their undertaking became starkly apparent. Friedrich laid out plans for their next operation, a sabotage mission aimed at disrupting the local SS communications network. The success of the mission could save countless lives by hindering the coordination of raids on suspected resistance sympathizers. Yet, the risk of capture or death was high, and the moral cost of potentially harming innocent bystanders weighed heavily on Karl. The stark reality of his decision to resist hit Karl with full force. He had always believed in serving his country, in protecting his fellow Germans from harm. Now, he found himself plotting against the very apparatus that claimed to safeguard the nation. The lines between patriotism and treason, loyalty and betrayal, were no longer clear. As Karl wrestled with these thoughts, Friedrich's voice broke through his reverie. "It's not just about what we're fighting against, Karl. It's about what we're fighting for, a Germany free of tyranny, where our children can grow up without fear." The weight of Friedrich's words hung in the air. Karl realized that the moral quandary he faced was not unique to him. Each member of the resistance had likely wrestled with similar doubts and fears. Yet, they had all arrived at the same conclusion. The fight against the Nazi regime, despite its dangers and moral complexities, was a fight for the soul of their country. This realization did not make the path ahead any less perilous, nor did it quell the storm of doubts that raged within Karl. But it did provide a glimmer of clarity. The moral landscape of war was fraught with shades of gray, and the choices he faced were not between good and evil, but between varying degrees of sacrifice and necessity. In the days that followed, Karl threw himself into the preparations for the mission with a newfound resolve. He studied maps, memorized timetables, and rehearsed every step of the operation. Yet, the moral quandary remained, a constant companion that shadowed his every move. The night before the mission, Karl lay awake, staring into the darkness. The enormity of what they were about to undertake, the lives that could be changed or lost, the ripple effects of their actions, pressed down on him with suffocating weight. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a sense of peace began to emerge. Karl understood that the path he had chosen was not one of destruction, but of hope. In fighting for a future where such moral quandaries need not exist, he was affirming the value of the very principles he feared compromising. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the cracks of his modest apartment, Carl prepared to step out into the uncertain day. The moral quandary that had once threatened to consume him now served as a reminder of the stakes for which they fought, the vision of a better Germany that lay beyond the darkness of the present. With a deep breath, Carl set forth to meet Friedrich and the others, knowing that the choices ahead would be no less difficult, the moral landscape no less complex. But he also knew that in the face of tyranny, the act of resistance, with all its moral ambiguity, was an affirmation of humanity's enduring capacity for hope and courage. The sabotage operation was a success. Under the cover of darkness, Carl and his companions had executed their plan flawlessly, leaving the SS's communications network in disarray. As dawn broke over the city, Carl felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear. They had struck a significant blow against the Nazi regime, but the danger of retribution loomed larger than ever. In the days that followed, the mood among the resistance members was cautiously optimistic. The success of their operation had proven their capabilities and strengthened their resolve. Carl, once a reluctant recruit, now found himself at the heart of the planning for their next moves. The shadows he had stepped into offered a sense of purpose he had never known, a clarity that came with fighting for a cause he believed in. Friedrich introduced Carl to more members of the network, each with their own stories of awakening to the evils of the regime. Among them was Anna, a young woman whose sharp intelligence and fierce determination belied her gentle appearance. She had lost family to the concentration camps, and her grief had transformed into a relentless drive for justice. Carl felt an immediate kinship with Anna, their shared losses forging a bond of mutual understanding and respect. Together, they worked tirelessly, their operations growing in ambition and scale. They distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, orchestrated the escape of prisoners from labor camps, and relayed critical information to the Allies. With each successful mission, the risks grew, but so did their ingenuity and courage. Carl's involvement with the resistance brought a profound sense of camaraderie. The isolation he had felt as doubts about the war and the Nazi ideology crept into his mind was replaced by a sense of belonging. In the company of Friedrich, Anna, and the others, he found a family bound not by blood, but by a shared commitment to freedom and justice. However, with increased activity came increased scrutiny. The Gestapo began closing in, their presence a constant shadow over the resistance's efforts. Carl and his companions were forced to operate with even greater caution, their meetings more secretive, their plans more carefully guarded. It was during this time of heightened danger that Carl was tasked with his most challenging mission yet. A high-ranking Nazi official, known for his brutal crackdown on dissent, was scheduled to visit Berlin. The resistance saw an opportunity to strike a symbolic blow against the regime, and Carl was chosen to lead the operation. The planning was meticulous, every detail scrutinized for potential pitfalls. Carl felt the weight of responsibility heavily upon him. The mission was not just about the target, but about sending a message to both the oppressors and the oppressed. The resistance was strong, and hope was not lost. The night of the operation arrived with a tense anticipation. Carl and his team moved through the shadows, each step bringing them closer to their objective. The streets of Berlin, so familiar yet now so fraught with danger, echoed with the silent prayers of those who dared to defy tyranny. As they neared their target, Carl's heart raced. The months of training, the years of growing disillusionment with the Nazi regime, all culminated in this moment. He thought of his family, of Anna, of Friedrich, and of all those who had suffered under the regime's cruelty. This was for them. The operation was a success, but not without cost. They had underestimated the security detail, leading to a confrontation that left one of their own critically wounded. As they retreated into the night, Karl's elation at the mission's success was tempered by the stark reminder of the stakes they were playing for. In the aftermath, the resistance was forced to lay low as the Gestapo's efforts intensified. Karl spent anxious days and sleepless nights in hiding, the joy of their victory overshadowed by the fear of what was to come. Yet, even as the danger mounted, so did the resolve of Karl and his fellow resistance members. They had stepped into the shadows not just to hide but to fight, and each act of defiance, each small victory, illuminated the darkness of those times with flickers of hope and courage. In those moments of reflection, Karl understood the true meaning of resistance. It was more than sabotage and espionage. It was the assertion of humanity in the face of inhumanity, the refusal to succumb to despair, and the relentless pursuit of a future where light would once again prevail over the shadows. In the wake of their daring operation against the high-ranking Nazi official, Karl and the resistance felt the noose of the Gestapo tighten around them. The city that once offered avenues for clandestine movements now felt like a maze designed to trap them at every turn. The success of their mission had come at a high price, one that would soon become even steeper. The first indication of the Gestapo's closing grip came with the disappearance of Marcus, one of their most daring operatives. His absence cast a shadow over the group, a chilling reminder of the risks they faced. Then, barely a week later, came the news that another member had been arrested, caught in the act of distributing leaflets. Karl felt the walls closing in. The meetings that had once been sources of strength and planning now took on a somber tone. Paranoia crept in, poisoning the trust that had bound them together. Each member knew that it was only a matter of time before the Gestapo might come for them. The decision to pause their activities was a difficult one, made in the dead of night in a secluded basement. Friedrich's voice was heavy with regret as he spoke. "We must go silent for a time. It's the only way to protect what we've built and to ensure that we can continue our work when the time is right." The silence that followed was a painful acknowledgement of their vulnerability. Karl wrestled with frustration and fear, the inaction chafing against his desire to fight back. Yet, he understood the necessity of the decision. The price of their silence was steep, measured in the lives of those they could no longer help and the spread of the tyranny they could not immediately fight against. During this period of forced inactivity, Karl found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The ideals that had drawn him into the resistance now seemed both clearer and more distant than ever. The fight against the Nazi regime was not just a battle of bombs and espionage, but a deeper struggle for the soul of their country. It was during this time of reflection that tragedy struck. News arrived one bleak morning that the member who had been arrested was executed without trial, a stark message from the regime to those who dared resist. The news sent shockwaves through the group, a palpable grief for the loss of their comrade and a sobering reminder of the stakes of their struggle. Karl felt the loss deeply, the silence they had hoped would be their shield now feeling like a weight, a suffocating blanket under which they were forced to hide their grief and rage. The price of silence, he realized, was not just inaction but the emotional toll of knowing they could not openly mourn, could not scream their defiance against the injustice. Yet, in the depths of this despair, a resolve began to form within Karl and his fellow resistance members. They understood that their silence was not surrender but a temporary retreat, a chance to regroup and to honor the sacrifices of those who had fallen by continuing their work with even greater determination. As the chapter closes, Karl and the resistance face the future with a somber resolve. The price of silence had been exacted in full, but the spirit of resistance, the drive to fight against tyranny, remained unbroken. In the memory of their fallen comrade, they found not just grief, but a renewed commitment to their cause, a silent vow to continue the fight until the darkness that had enveloped their country was finally lifted. The days following the execution were marked by a heavy silence, a collective mourning that transcended words. Karl, Friedrich, Anna, and the rest of their group wrestled with their grief, each in their own way. The fight against the Nazi regime had always been perilous, but now the cost was painfully tangible. It was during one of their clandestine meetings, hidden away in the basement of an abandoned factory, that the flicker of hope reignited their resolve. Friedrich arrived with news that would alter the course of their struggle. "The Allies have made significant advances in the West," he announced, spreading a smuggled map across the table. The room leaned in, eyes tracing the lines that marked the progress of forces pushing against the Nazi front. This news was a beacon in the gloom that had settled over them. The tide of the war was turning, and for the first time in months, the possibility of an end to the Nazi regime seemed within grasp. The realization that their fight was part of a larger struggle, that the world had not turned a blind eye to the horrors unfolding within Germany, infused the group with a renewed sense of purpose. Karl felt the shift within him, a lifting of the weight that had pressed down since the loss of their comrade. The resistance was not just a flicker in the darkness. It was a spark contributing to a greater blaze that sought to purge the tyranny that had consumed their country. Emboldened by this news, the group began to plan their next steps. Their operations had been stymied by grief and the need for caution, but now there was a reason to renew their efforts. They discussed ways to support the Allied advance, from sabotaging Nazi supply lines to providing intelligence gathered from within Berlin. Anna, who had been quiet since the announcement, spoke up, her voice steady and infused with a resolve that matched the determination in her eyes. "We owe it to those who've sacrificed everything to see this through. We fight not just for the Germany of today, but for the hope of a better tomorrow." Her words galvanized the group, a rallying cry that reminded them of the stakes for which they fought. The loss of their comrade would not be in vain. It would be the fuel that powered their continued resistance. As the meeting drew to a close, Karl and his companions emerged from the shadows, not as a band worn by grief, but as a unified front against the darkness. The news of the Allies' advance was more than a military shift. It was a symbol that their dreams of a free Germany were not folly, but a vision that was slowly, inexorably, becoming reality. Karl walked home under the cover of night, the streets of Berlin quiet around him. The fear and uncertainty that had been constant companions seemed to recede, if only for a moment. In their place was hope, fragile yet unyielding, a glimmer in the darkness that guided his steps. The fight was far from over and the path ahead remained fraught with danger. But for the first time in a long while, Karl felt the stirrings of optimism, a belief that the world he fought for, a world free from the scourge of Nazism, was not just a distant dream, but a future within reach. With the Allies making strides on the war's external fronts, the internal battle within the heart of Berlin became ever more perilous. The Gestapo's shadow loomed large over Karl and his fellow resistors, a constant reminder that their every move was watched, their every whisper potentially overheard. As spring began to thaw the harsh Berlin winter, the Gestapo's efforts intensified. Raids became more frequent, and the network of informants grew denser, weaving a web of surveillance from which few could escape. The resistance felt the squeeze, their movements restricted, their plans disrupted by the ever-present threat of betrayal. Karl experienced this pressure most acutely. A close call during a routine information drop left him rattled, the realization that he had narrowly escaped capture a sobering reminder of the stakes. The walls of his apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the air heavy with the fear of the knock that could come at any hour. The Resistance's operations were forced to adapt. Meetings were shorter, less frequent, and always in motion. Codes and ciphers became more complex, their messages passing through a labyrinthine network of couriers designed to confound even the most diligent pursuer. It was during one of these fleeting meetings that Friedrich brought troubling news. "They're closing in," he whispered, a taut edge to his voice. "One of our safe houses was compromised. We lost 3 of our own last night." The news struck Karl like a physical blow. The loss of any member of the resistance was a tragedy, but the implications of a compromised safe house were dire. It meant there was a leak, a betrayal from within that could unravel everything they had worked for. The group was forced into a painful decision. To preserve what remained of their network, they would need to isolate themselves, severing many of their established connections and operating in even smaller cells. Trust, the very foundation of their resistance, was now a luxury they could scarcely afford. Karl found himself tasked with an almost impossible mission. He was to retrieve a cache of important documents hidden within one of the compromised safe houses before the Gestapo could find them. The risk was immense, but the value of the information contained within those papers, names, locations, plans, was incalculable. It was a mission born of desperation, a daring play in a game where the stakes were life and death. The night of the operation was fraught with tension. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential alarm. Karl moved through the streets with a blend of caution and haste, aware that this might be his last mission, either for the resistance or in life. Reaching the safe house, Karl found it eerily untouched. The documents were exactly where they had been hidden, but as he made to leave, the trap was sprung. Gestapo agents, having been lying in wait, attempted to seize him. What followed was a desperate escape, a chase through darkened alleys and over rooftops, a test of wills between the hunter and the hunted. Karl's escape was narrow, a testament to both his training and sheer luck. Returning to the resistance with the documents, he was met not with celebration but with a grim acknowledgement of the close call and the realization that their situation was more precarious than ever. In the aftermath, the resistance was forced to change tactics. Their efforts became even more covert, their plans more audacious. Karl, recognized for his bravery and quick thinking, found himself at the center of this new strategy. Yet, the close encounter with the Gestapo had changed him. He was more cautious, yes, but also more determined. The fear of capture had been eclipsed by a greater fear, that of failing to do everything in his power to oppose the regime that had brought so much suffering. In a condensed format, Chapter 8, The Final Stand, captures the crescendo of the Resistance's efforts against the Nazi regime, detailing a pivotal operation that marks both a culmination of their struggle and a testament to their courage. As the war's end seemed increasingly inevitable, with the Allies pressing in from all sides, the resistance within Berlin knew their next move could be their most critical yet. The Gestapo's noose tightened, and the stakes for Karl and his companions had never been higher. Despite the risks, they planned a daring act of defiance that would echo far beyond the war-torn streets of their city. The target was a heavily guarded facility where the Gestapo stored crucial records and communications. Destroying it would not only cripple the Nazis' internal operations, but also send a powerful message of resilience and hope to the German people and the Allied forces. Karl, alongside Friedrich, Anna, and a handful of their most trusted allies, undertook the painstaking task of planning the operation. Every detail was scrutinized, from the timing of the guards' shifts to the layout of the building's interior. This mission was the culmination of all they had fought for, a final stand against the darkness that had enveloped their country. The night of the operation was tense with anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain, the streets eerily quiet. Karl and his team moved like shadows, each aware of the part they played in this critical moment. The plan was simple but bold: infiltrate the facility, plant the explosives, and escape before the dawn revealed their deed to the world. The operation was fraught with danger. Karl and Anna led one team, their movements synchronized to the second, while Friedrich and the others created a diversion to draw the guards' attention away from their true target. The tension was palpable, a tangible force that drove them forward with relentless urgency. As they breached the facility's outer defenses, Karl felt a surge of adrenaline. The years of fighting, of loss and sacrifice, had led to this moment. Inside, they encountered resistance, a skirmish that tested their resolve and their readiness. Karl fought with a quiet fury, driven by the memories of those they had lost and the future they sought to secure. The explosives were set with precision, the timers ticking down the minutes to their inevitable conclusion. As they made their escape, the first hints of dawn began to light the eastern sky, a symbolic heralding of the new beginning they hoped to bring about. The explosion, when it came, was a shockwave that rippled through the city, a declaration of defiance that could not be ignored. Karl and his team watched from a safe distance, the flames reflecting in their eyes, a bittersweet testament to their journey. In the aftermath, the resistance knew their actions would have consequences. The Gestapo's retaliation would be swift and brutal, but the blow they had struck was a significant one. The destruction of the facility was not just a physical victory, but a moral one, a sign that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit's desire for freedom could not be quenched. Karl, Friedrich, Anna, and the others retreated into the shadows once more, their hearts heavy with the cost of their fight, but lightened by the hope they had ignited. Their final stand was not the end of their struggle, but a beacon for those who would continue the fight, a legacy of resistance that would outlive the war and the tyranny they sought to overthrow. In a condensed form, Chapter 9, Aftermath and Reflection, weaves together the threads of loss, hope, and the enduring spirit of resistance, as Karl and his allies confront the aftermath of their final stand and reflect on their journey. The war was drawing to a close. The streets of Berlin, scarred by the years of conflict, bore witness to the final throes of a regime that had plunged the world into darkness. For Karl and the remnants of the resistance, the end of the war was not just a victory of Allied forces, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit against tyranny. In the days following their daring operation, the city was a maelstrom of chaos and liberation. The Gestapo's grip loosened as the Allies advanced, and the people of Berlin, long suppressed under the weight of fear, began to breathe the air of freedom once more. Karl, Friedrich, and Anna found themselves walking the streets of their city, no longer as shadowy figures of the resistance, but as citizens of a nation on the brink of rebirth. The destruction they had wrought on the Gestapo's facility was a catalyst, one among countless acts of defiance that had chipped away at the Nazi edifice. Yet, the victory was bittersweet. The cost of their struggle was written in the faces of those they had lost, in the memories of the horrors they had witnessed. The joy of liberation was tempered by the grief for those who could not share in it, a reminder of the price paid for freedom. As they gathered one last time, in the same hidden basement that had been their haven, the mood was reflective. They shared stories of the fallen, laughter and tears mingling in a tribute to their courage. Karl listened, a deep sense of gratitude filling him for the journey he had shared with these remarkable individuals. The conversation turned to the future, to the Germany that would rise from the ashes of war. They spoke of hope, of the lessons learned from the darkness of tyranny, and the light of democracy that promised a new dawn. Karl realized that their fight was not in vain. It was the foundation upon which a better future would be built. In the aftermath of war, Karl dedicated himself to rebuilding his country, his efforts informed by the ideals that had driven him to resist. He worked towards a Germany that valued freedom, justice, and human dignity, a legacy of the resistance that would endure in the hearts of those who believed in a world free from oppression.